I also, I'm going to give Biden credit for something else. And maybe it's just, I can't help myself. I'm going to give the underdog credit. There are a lot of things I
You're
haven't liked
already
about Joe Biden.
nostalgic for the Biden era. You're already nostalgic for the Biden era.
I wouldn't say I'm nostalgic for the Biden era, but that's good. That's funny. This is Paul Johnson with New Frontiers. Today we have our panel back and we discuss a whole wide variety of issues. You're going to hear a discussion where we talk about what's happening in the political system and the divisiveness of our political parties and some of the reform efforts that relate to that. We have a robust discussion about what's going on in world politics, what's taking place in Ukraine, Syria, with Russia, as well as looking at what has happened with Israel. It's a fun discussion. We also talk about the assassination of the UnitedHealthCare executive. And finally, we end with a good discussion on what's taking place with AI technology, both with Google, with their new Willow chip, Gemini 2, as well as Grok with Elon Musk. Thanks for being with us. Now, I'm just an ordinary, optimistic American who still believes that the United States is a cause for good. We appreciate you being a subscriber. If you like what it is that we're doing, push that subscribe button and let's get this show going.
Destiny. Destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. 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 You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Well, first, I'd like to welcome back all my panelists to the New Frontiers. It's the holidays. I was going to say it's Christmas, but I guess we should recognize that we have there are a number of different holidays that are going on right now as well. And Eliott, I'd like to welcome you back to our show. I'm not sure what you're doing this holiday season.
Oh, I'm basically going to my sister-in-law's for Christmas and then taking off to California.
Awesome. Henry, Christmas. What are you doing at Christmas and the holidays?
I'm going to have a few friends over. I'm going to cook a big roast of beef and open a couple of good bottles of wine. And I think we're going to have a pretty nice afternoon.
That's awesome. Bob, what are you all doing for Christmas this season?
Well, we're here with our family here for Christmas Day, and then headed after that to the Portland area to visit our son, daughter-in-law, and grandson.
So we have a number of things that we do in the Christmas holiday, but our big Christmas holiday event is called Viking Christmas. We like to argue in our family that Christmas was really originally a Viking holiday. It was called Yuletide. There were 12 days of Yuletide that would start at solstice and go all the way through the new year. But I actually picked it up because I have 14 grandkids and I got tired of going to everybody's house at 7 o'clock in the morning and arguing about which one I should be at 7 o'clock in the morning. So we do like a 4-day event right around New Year's where I bring all the kids up to our cabin. Many of their parents show up as well. We do a scavenger hunt. We do what are called snow graves, where the dad go out in the snow and the kids dig a hole and they then bury you and figure out which dad can stay in there the longest. We have a Yuletide feast, kind of like the Feast of the Epiphany. And then Old Man Winter comes and gives them all their gifts, and I get to do it all at once. But and I also tell them the stories about how the Vikings actually created Christmas. So I get to put in my ethnic point of view on the way there. So I'm going to, as we're right before the holidays, there are a series of issues here that were kind of fun. One of them, Bob wrote an article on about a week ago, and that's kind of what's taking place with the independent movement. You know, what we know, one of the things I saw that was fascinating in the Arizona Republic today was that independents voted almost equal to Republican voters nationwide. The Democratic voters were down, but that independent voters were only 1 point behind Republican voters. If that number is correct, and I'm doing some checking on it to make sure that it is, but if that number is correct, that's a significant improvement for independent voters in terms of turnout. What I've recognized is that there, for a very long period of time, people have been disassociating with the two parties. But the downside to the disassociation with the parties is that we've increasingly left kind of a distilled voter inside of both parties that are more ideologically driven. We tried to create a change here in the state of Arizona by running an open primary. I was deeply involved in that effort. I wouldn't say I was running it, but I was probably one of the top 4 or 5 people inside the movement. We lost pretty handily. We lost by about a 60-40 margin. And one of the things I'm doing, we're going to end up doing it again, I'm out trying to listen to advice from people as to what they thought that we did wrong, how maybe we mishandled it. And Bob, you wrote a great article on that. So I'd love to just start with you and give me your input about whether you like what we did, what mistakes you think we made, where you think we could make improvements on it.
Well, thank you, Paul. I think there was a design flaw in this one that made it impossible for it to have any chance of succeeding. As you know more intimately than perhaps anybody, there's a division within the reform movement between those who want a top 2 primary. You have an open primary, that's common to both reform efforts, where all candidates compete. And then the question is, what happens in the general election? You have those that say, well, just take the 2 top vote getters, irrespective of what party they come from, and then have them run off in the general election. And then you have people who want to see more than 2 move from the primary to the general election, and then decide the outcome through ranked choice voting. Rather than decide which option to offer the people of Arizona, this particular proposition left that open, and left it up to the legislature to decide, or in absence of a decision by the legislature, a single elected official, the Secretary of State. And as important as primaries are in reality, given the distribution of political ideology geographically, people naturally believe that the general election is the more important one. That's where the final decision is made as to who the office holder is going to be. And I think it was simply unsaleable to say we're going to leave that up in the air. The most important election, we're not going to tell you how it's going to be conducted. And we're either going to give it to a legislature, which is not popularly regarded, or we're going to leave it up to a single elected official, the Secretary of State. My own view is that ranked choice doesn't fit Arizona because of all the people whom we elect. If you go to an off-presidential election, there are 13 or 14 individual candidate races that are going to be covered by whatever reform takes place. Well, that's asking people to make 13 or 14 distinct decisions. If you have 4 candidates moving on to the general election, you got to rank choice each of them. Well, then suddenly those 13 distinct decisions become 56 decisions or something in that range. And that's simply asking too much from the voters. So I think the reform that has a chance in Arizona is more similar to the first effort that you led back in the 2010s, where you have the open primary, but then you leave it as much like the existing system as you can. And you do have a top 2 runoff election. That's a general election that's similar to what people are familiar with. And if it's a nonpartisan primary, which I would like it to be, then it is exactly the same as the system that's used in Arizona to elect virtually every city council in the state. I think there's only 1 or 2 exceptions to that. So it would be a very familiar reform where the only issue for the voter becomes, do we continue to give partisans on the left and partisans on the right this hugely disproportionate influence in deciding who our general election options consist of, rather than leaving that stage open to all voters on an equal basis for all candidates and all voters.
And Bob, you also had placed in your article some conversation around the idea of whether we should run it during a presidential election or the gubernatorial election, I believe, if I recall in your article. What was your thought on that?
Well, it's not a conclusion that I reached, but the general conventional wisdom has been that the best chance of reform occurs at the general election, because there you have the largest turnout and the largest turnout of young people and independents who are thought to be more open to this kind of reform. And I believe that that is solid thinking. That is absolutely true. But I also think that you need to compete effectively to overcome the inertia and the organized opposition of the two political parties. You have to compete for the public's attention. And that's tough to do in a presidential race. And particularly one where there's a US Senate race also on the ballot. Those two races just kind of drown out everybody else. And in an off-presidential election, I think a ballot measure can compete with, for instance, a governor's race for public attention. But I think that there is a burden that the reform side has to make the case that requires the ability to get through to voters and overcome the inertia and what the opposition, particularly the two incumbent political parties who benefit from the current system, will throw out during the election. So that was a thought that I wanted to throw out for people to gnaw on a bit. I'm not convinced at all that the benefits of greater attention to the reform and the ability to compete for public attention exceeds the benefit of the broader turnout that you would see in a general, in a presidential election year. But I think it's worth thinking about.
Eliott, from your vantage point, both economically as well as being involved in the community, how do you see the open primary concept?
Well, this is one thing. Bob, let me ask you one thing about what you said. So essentially, are you talking about a primary where the top two vote getters get into the general election regardless of party?
Correct.
So there could be elections in theory where a Democrat or Republican don't get into the final two.
Yes, or you could have two Democrats, two Republicans, and my preference is that they be nonpartisan, that party labels aren't actually on the ballot, so that the party activity becomes an entirely private affair.
Well, I actually like that a lot. It's a question, though, of whether you're going to get to be able to pass that in a world that essentially now has three constituencies: Republican, Democrat, and Independent. As a concept, I like it a lot. There's always the risk, though, that you get this huge turnout to get two of one party on the ballot, and that would be interesting.
Yeah, you know, Eliott, on that point, we did significant polling, and that's one of the worries, right? Because one of the things the opposition says is, hey, I don't like the idea that you could have two Democrats or two Republicans.
Yeah.
That actually didn't move the public needle very much, nearly as much as I would have thought that it did. And if you go to it from a factual standpoint and think about it this way, 70% of the 5,000 seats in America are decided in the primary. Effectively, there is no general election. So by the time you get to a general election, you only have one choice, right, as opposed to two choices. What happens in an open primary when you end up with two choices there, even if they're both Democrat or both Republican, which, by the way, is very rare. The states have been doing this for a long time. It usually ends up being one person from each one of the two parties who show up. However, the candidates who survive the open primary they have to go talk to people on the other side. You can't win the race by just talking to Republicans alone. You have to go talk to Democrats. Or if you're a Democrat, you can't win by just talking to Democrats. You have to go talk to Republicans and independents. And that in itself has an effect on, I'm going to call it moderating. I don't know if that's the right word because candidates still can be ideological inside an open primary, but the idea that they've had to listen to people on the other side has an effect on how they see things. They begin to address issues from a larger community standpoint.
So let me just ask you about the Kerry Lake Robeson primary. There was a primary where they both tried to push to the edge. Only one of them was serious about it, and she won. And I think that she did tremendous damage to her own party because I believe she cost the party in Arizona the gubernatorial race as well as the Senate race. But how do you prevent that? How will this prevent that? I mean,
well, yeah. Let me talk about that issue, and part of this is theory, right? Some of it's. I just want to make certain that when you're talking about this, it's hypothetical. You're talking about alternatively what might have happened had we had a different system.
Right, and it's just my opinion. Yeah, that's all.
That's right. And this is my opinion. So let's start with this. My guess is there's very large rumors that I think are pretty significant that the governor, Katie Hobbs, raised $2 to $3 million to oppose us legally inside the court system, which delayed us and had some negative consequences. We couldn't raise money during that period of time. Well, you might ask the question, well, why would she do that? Why would she do that? Why would she be opposed to an open primary? Well, the theory on the Democratic side goes like this. If I can just win my primary, an odds-on favorite, Katie Hobbs won't have an opponent in her primary. If I can just clear my primary, then I'm going to end up running against somebody in a general election who's going to be supported by the Republican Party. And the Republican Party is probably going to elect a far-right MAGA candidate. And if they elect a MAGA candidate, Katie Hobbs believes that's her best odds to win. Now, again, she hasn't told me this. I'm speculating as to what I believe or why I believe she would have raised money to oppose us in this election, because it guarantees her best chance of being able to win. Now, if she would have had an open primary in the last season, this is my guess, Robeson wouldn't have tried to appeal to the extreme. She'd have tried to appeal to the moderates, and she'd have won. And if she'd have won that primary, and it would have been she and Katie Hobbs in the general election, she'd probably be governor today. And my guess is Katie Hobbs not only knows that, but she's worried about it and doesn't want to be able to create a repeat. The challenge for Democrats that they had to think about is they thought that was a for sure formula. I don't know if anybody paid attention, but a lot of MAGA candidates won this time. A lot of MAGA candidates who were pretty conservative on the far right side were able to win. It certainly wasn't a good strategy for this election, but that's my guess as to why Katie Hobbs would want to keep it in place. The gold standard for everyone else is no opponent. And when 70% of the races are decided in the primary, well, if you can eliminate your primary opponent in a stacked district, you're not going to have any opponent to worry about. Henry, any thoughts?
This is a super interesting conversation, and I think you illuminated some of the elite level dynamics that are going on around this issue, Paul, and that will continue to go on with people strategizing, especially at the elite level, about whether these sorts of reforms to the electoral system are going to be in their favor or not. And another factor that occurs to me that you're pushing against is the electorate, right? I mean, you say that there's as many independent voters as Republicans and Democrats, and that's true according to voter registration, but how many of those people are actually independents? This is, there are these two stories going on at the same time about the American electorate. One is that we've got this increasing polarization, especially affective polarization, that people define themselves against the other party at incredibly high rates. But at the same time, we've got this bigger group of independents emerging. And how does that happen? Well, essentially, a lot of those people in that group in the middle of independents, they're not independent at all. They are highly partisan. They just haven't registered with one party or the other for whatever reason. And so, yes, the elites are going to strategize about whether these reforms help them get elected or their favored candidates get elected. But you're also pushing against an electorate that might appear more open to electoral reform than it really is, because whatever proportion of these independents, whether it's a half or 2/3 or 80%, they're actually in their camps. And the thought that Eliott raised, that they could end up in a situation where their party doesn't have a candidate in the general election, they're not gonna countenance it. So I think there's different layers to this problem, but I do think the electorate is less receptive to reform than it might appear at first glance.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to knock us too much. We lost, and we lost handily, but 40% of the public voted in favor of it. 40% of the public says, hey, we need some type of reform. Somewhere, you're right, independents make up about 35%. My guess is about 70% of the independents supported it, 30% didn't. Overwhelmingly, more independents supported it than Democrats or Republicans from all the data that we can see, at least currently. Democrats were in support until they began to hear from the party that they weren't in support. Although we had a number of high-profile Democrats and certainly high-profile Republicans that were in support of it, almost all of them were past elected leaders. I can't think of any current elected leaders that were actually supportive of it, but there were a lot of past leaders. Well, we had, people who've been in Arizona for a while know one of the great matchups was Terry Goddard and Vi Symington. Both of them were in support of this effort. We had people on both sides, but they were almost all past elected officials. Bob, one last thought that I would ask you is there's one of the things that's been put out there by a variety of different people is that in the races that have been won with an open primary, they usually happen by one of two factors. Either a major elected official running for office was supportive of it, as in the case of Murkowski in Alaska, who supported. By the way, one of the things that's done for Murkowski, she's a Republican, but she has become a very independent Republican. She has no problem opposing the Republican Party when she doesn't like it. And it drives them nuts because they can't primary her. They can't primary her the way that they once could. The other places where it's won is where one of the two parties supported it. Now, that usually won't happen in a state like Arizona because both parties are competitive. And so both of them kind of want to keep the existing system in place. But in states like Alaska, where it's, 70-30 or maybe it's 60-40 Republican versus Democrat, it was the minority party has no chance of winning, so the open primary becomes something that they support. The point here is maybe we didn't do a good enough job of building coalitions. Any thought on that?
I think in Arizona, it's possible to win this reform fight without the kind of endorsement from either an existing party or an existing elected official. While it may be true that there is a tendency among independents to lean one way or the other, or even strongly one way or the other, there's also a very strong swing voter renewal in Arizona. You saw it in 2018 when approximately 225,000 Arizonans voted for Kirsten Sinema for U.S. Senator and Republican Doug Ducey for governor. In this last election, Arizona simultaneously went for Donald Trump for president and Ruben Gallego, a very progressive Democrat, for U.S. Senate. Arizona is a center-right polity. And right now, a center-right candidate does not have a path to the general election ballot because a center-right candidate cannot win a Republican primary in today's Republican Party. I don't think that sort of disassociation between what the current system produces in terms of political leadership versus what the public desires for political leadership, which isn't a choice between a Democrat and a MAGA Republican, can long survive. And I believe that that case can be made directly to the dissatisfied electorate. I mean, I don't know of anyone who walks around saying, I'm really delighted with our political leadership, either at the national level or at the state level. I believe that case can be made and will need to be made over the heads of, in Arizona, the existing parties and existing elected officials, all of whom benefit from the existing system.
Yeah, Bob, that's probably, I've spoken to dozens, maybe hundreds of people at this point about what we did wrong. I think that these are very good points. The first one is this whole concept that that it's so far down ballot that people don't know that it's there. It is amazing to me how few people understood that we were even on the ballot, who knew which number it was that they needed to vote for, that they were confused by the legislative effort versus our effort. The legislature put another item on the ballot to try to confuse the public, which was the exact opposite of our measure. But at the bottom of it, it said, voting against this means you would keep the existing political system, right? But it was designed to try and confuse people. And all of that makes it more difficult to sell the case. In fact, if you look at both our polling and if you listen to our arguments when we would go in front of a group, the opposition arguments did not work very well. What really did work well is an overwhelming majority who didn't know about the measure, who didn't understand the measure. They were just driven by a tweet that they might have gotten from Planned Parenthood or from Donald Trump or from listening to what was going on with the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. It was a very surface message. And if you can't break through that, you can't win. And to break through that, you need to be able to have attention. And your idea of putting it in an off-election cycle may be one that's meritorious and worth listening to. The other thing that I find to be interesting in Republican Party politics, I'll just make this as a commentary. It used to be rhino Republicans that the Republicans didn't like. And that was defined as kind of the Sue Gerard types who were maybe left on social issues, but they were still Republican conservatives. There's a whole lot more Republicans being thrown out of the party today than just what they used to call the mushy middle. All right, it's the national security folks, the people who are hawks on foreign defense, people who experts of almost any time or all of any type are just considered to be elitist. There's a variety of those groups who, if they don't buy into the theories that are new and evolving on the Republican side, much of which are embattled with what they consider to be the elitists in society, you're out. And it just means that there's a much larger group of Republicans who now are considered to be rhinos that weren't in the past. I want to go next to the other article that you did this week, Bob. I thought it was a great piece on American foreign policy. And you covered a lot in this article. You talked about what was happening in Syria. I believe you talked a little bit about what was happening in Ukraine. You spoke about tariffs. But the theme of the article seemed to be about how we deal with the transition of power in this country and how that norm is changing. Can you give us a description of the article?
Sure. And it was about how unusual Trump's activity is during this period. There's been sort of an unwritten protocol that has governed these things for quite a while, which is on domestic policy, the outgoing administration tries to rush to the end and get as much done as they can, even if it's being handed over to an opposition party who will spend the first part of their administration trying to undo some of that kind of stuff. That sort of tug of war on domestic policy is common. But there has always been an attempt to present a firm resolution to the rest of the world that the United States only has one president at a time, and most importantly, only one commander in chief at a time. And during this period, the incoming president tends to be circumspect about international affairs and events. And while there are liaisons made with foreign governments, that's done discreetly and privately. It is wholly unsurprising that Trump would feel not at all bound or constrained by this unwritten protocol. And even though he's not president, he is issuing serial pronunciations on foreign affairs and saying that this should be done and that should be done, and there'll be hell to play if this isn't done by the time I get inaugurated. And he's holding very public meetings with foreign officials. In the column, I kind of go through each of these kind of outbursts in what they may or may not mean. But the major point was this is a preview of how chaotic and erratic the second Trump term is likely to be.
And one of the points that you made that was interesting was this whole point on Hamas, the idea that he was giving them until he was inaugurated to be able to give up the hostages. The point I believe that you made was that was more designed for political credit than maybe it was designed for results. Can you give us that thought?
His threat was, he said, if the hostages aren't released by the time I'm inaugurated, there will be hell to pay, and that the United States will unleash force unlike we've ever unleashed in our history. Well, what in the world could Trump threaten to do to Hamas that Israel hasn't already done or isn't willing to do? I mean, Gaza's in large measure decimated. And if Hamas, he didn't say exactly whom he was threatening. So if Hamas wasn't the target, is it Iran as its patron? And if so, what is he threatening Iran with? More lethal force than we deployed against Germany and Japan? It was an utterly meaningless and purposeless truth social. And I believe it was a politically calculated move so that if, as now appears possible, the hostages are released prior to his inauguration, that he can claim credit and his acolytes can claim credit, that it was just his threat, even though it was a wholly meaningless and empty threat.
Well, look, this is just like what Reagan did during the Iranian hostage situation, where he let it be known that if they're not out by the time I'm president, you guys are going to basically regret it. And it was just a carbon copy of that. And not every political...
There were things that Reagan could do that hadn't been done. What in the world can Trump do to Hamas that hasn't already been done?
Send in a SEAL team, see if they do any better. But the bottom line is that I don't know why you'd be surprised by Trump making this type of statement. A lot of his statements are bravado. A lot of his statements are for effect. And I think he gets the message across. I think you're just dealing with a different situation. And I would dare say America doesn't have a president at the moment. Harris has fallen off the edge of the earth, and Biden basically is ready for the home. So we don't have a president at the moment. So he is filling the void. Am I happy with that? I'm glad somebody is.
I agree with Eliott. The elephant in the room here is Biden. I mean, he's still nominally the president, but I think that since this disastrous debate, essentially no one has listened to anything he says. And so there's a total vacuum. And yes, if Trump is doing his usual thing and making statements that are bravado and don't make a lot of sense, that's not really surprising. But perhaps if Biden was more out in front of these issues, then people would be reporting at least as much about him as what Trump is saying. Whereas I don't see very much leadership coming from the White House at all at this point on foreign policy. So I think that's really the combination.
Well, they did sell the wall at $5 a panel. I thought that was, that's if that's the best he can do, we're in trouble.
I know when someone wins, they're the hero, and I know when someone loses, they're the dog. I've been in politics long enough. I've been the dog more than once, so so I get it. That's what happens to the loser. Man, there are some amazing changes happening in the Middle East today. There are amazing changes that are happening. What's taking place with Syria today is a complete game changer in the Middle East, and it is going to dramatically reduce the power of Iran. Now, with Israel's largely responsible for that. I want to give them credit for it. I want to give them credit for what they did with Hamas and what they did with Hezbollah, both of which are measures that I support. Now, to be fair, Biden has not verbally always been supportive, but he sure was militarily. I mean, we parked those two big old aircraft carriers over in that Persian Gulf. That's not nothing. That's more than zero. And the fact that we intercepted those flights, that's more than zero. The fact that Syria didn't just get hit by bombs coming from Israel, but from the United States, that's not zero. In fact, I would say that a lot of the changes happening in the Middle East has been partly directed by Biden. Now, fair enough to say, in many cases, I've been irritated by the fact that he didn't get out of Israel's way. That's my own personal opinion. I think that we should have maybe played a lower profile role and let them go further. But there's still some good things happening there. And I guess the question is this: does Biden deserve zero credit for that?
I've been of the view for quite a while now that the American administration has not had much control over what's happening in the Middle East. And I don't think that they really played a big role in the downfall of Assad either. It seems like the regime was much shakier than people realize. And as soon as this rebel group started advancing on the capital, the defections by the military happened relatively quickly. So,
Henry, can I interrupt that point for a moment?
Yeah.
That may be true, but Biden supported Ukraine, and Ukraine took up a lot of energy out of Russia, and Russia couldn't support Syria, and that's why they fell.
That's part of the equation. But another part of the equation is that the Turks have been supporting the rebels and the Kurds in Syria, and they may have given the green light for these attacks to go ahead, etc. It's an extremely complicated and fluid situation. I mean, obviously, Biden has been the president, and the big policy decisions, he's played a major role in them, especially supporting Ukraine. But remember when Biden told Israel that they shouldn't go into various parts of Gaza, that they shouldn't do various things, that they shouldn't attack Hezbollah and Lebanon, etc., and they were essentially ignored. And so I just don't think that Biden has played a major role in directing the overall development of events in the Middle East. And I don't think, to be honest, he's playing much of a role in directing the developments in the Ukraine either.
Yeah, I would agree with Henry. I would agree with Henry. Now, I'm glad that he did deliver the weapons finally that Israel needed. But Israel has been doing America's dirty work in the Mideast since 1948. Okay, this isn't something new. And you finally had a prime minister who was willing to stand up and say, we're done with this. And say he basically told Biden and de facto, you can talk all you want. We're going to do what we want to do because it's our skin, not yours. And we should be sending them thank you notes every day of the week for doing that. And I just hope that we can finish the job in Iran. And in theory, they're just a few weeks away from an atomic weapon. So that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. And in terms of Syria, maybe the Turks will let it develop into some type of form of government where that isn't run by terrorists. But the history is not very good on that. And so I'm kind of skeptical. And so I don't think we're quite done there. I think we have to let Israel finish the job because they're doing our dirty work for us. There are no Americans that have been killed there, not a lot of troops, not a lot, whatever it is, they're doing our dirty work. And that's, to be honest with you, I don't know of another country that's ever done that.
So, Eliott, I agree with you on the first on what Israel's been able to accomplish. I want to make certain that I state that very clearly. I think Israel, with both Hamas and Hezbollah, have done an amazing job of pushing that back.
And Iran, because the way they struck back at Iran basically said, you know what, we can come and get you anywhere, anytime we want. And that couldn't have gone unnoticed.
Yeah, I mean, they've been flying sorties, I think, over Tehran, I was reading the other day. But my question is this, just so I see if you agree with this. The developments that have happened have been incredibly positive for the Western world in the last month. I mean,
unbelievably so. Unbelievably
there's
so.
no doubt there's a massive risk with the new Al-Qaeda group coming in. We don't know what they're going to do. They may be worse than Assad, but it's at least an opening that we didn't have before. Second, Syria is a bridgeway between Iran and Lebanon and their ability to be able to supply them with goods, and that's mainly been cut off. Israel has lost all three of their big proxies, both Syria, Hezbollah, and Hamas. That
you mean Iran has, not Israel.
Iran, I'm sorry. Iran has lost their allies in that. And that's going to make it more difficult for them to prosecute a lot of the trouble that they've prosecuted in the past. My point is, the evolution here has been good. Thoughts on that?
It's been great. And I'm not condemning Biden, although I didn't like when he was holding Israel hostage for some of these weapons. I thought that was really just dumb. Just plain dumb, to try to placate some college students who are being jackasses. But that's neither here nor there. They're allowed to be jackasses. That's America, unless you oppose what they say, and then you don't have that freedom apparently on some college campuses. But that's a different story. The bottom line is that the U.S. got lucky, and quite frankly, Israel got lucky because things might not have worked out this well, but Israel has done things that if you read in a Robert Ludlum book, you would have said, nah, that's too far-fetched. That would never happen. Basically, Israel is doing the things that we did right after September 11th. And we have basically become fat, dumb, and happy as a country. And it's going to bite us in the butt if we're not careful. So does Biden deserve to be criticized? Just a little. Was he helpful? Yeah, much more helpful than unhelpful. But it's basically what the Israelis did and their intelligence, which failed obviously on October 7th, but has been great since, that got us in this position. I'm only saying we have to finish the job. Biden gave Iran the money through the $10 billion he released basically the day he became president, and the probably $40-50 billion a year they're getting in oil revenues. That's Biden's. That's Biden who did that. He was the one who allowed this whole thing to happen. And that's not going to happen under Trump. That's the only good news I see here.
Let me just briefly, guys, I want to just give a cautionary note against premature celebration about this situation. Eliott, you raised the 9/11 parallel. We have no idea how these events are going to develop in the Middle East with a collapsed, failed state in Syria, with a borderline failed state in Lebanon, with a potentially nuclear armed and on the back foot Iran. We have no idea which way these things are going to develop. And we saw that in Iraq after the invasion. We saw that with the first phase of the Syrian civil war, which led to the refugee surge into Europe. And we've even seen it much more recently with the Ukraine conflict, where the Ukrainians beat back the Russians and seem to be on the front foot. And now it just seems to be this awful, grinding bloodbath over there. So let me just voice the caution. War is completely unpredictable. We have no idea how this is going to end up. And although a lot of these developments seem to be positive at this point, things could go wrong tomorrow or the next day in a very, very bad way.
Well, I'll just say that Americans tend to believe that people want democracy. In the Mideast, except for Israel, there is no country that has any background in democracy. They don't want it. They don't know how to handle it. And it's more likely than not that Syria will basically become a mess. All I'm saying is, if Iran has a nuclear weapon, that changes everything. And I hope that Israel doesn't let it happen, even if Biden basically is off whistling Dixie somewhere, ignoring the situation.
Well, he will be off whistling Dixie because he's going to be out of office. But Henry, to your point, the question I would ask is this. If you went back 6 months ago and you said, hey, these are the results of where we're going to end up. Russia is going to have an inability to be able to support Syria. Syria is going to fall. There's going to be a new group in, but we're not going to know what type of government they're going to have. We're going to have Hamas and Hezbollah defeated. Again, big credit to Israel. That's who I think played a major role. But with American weapons, American support, American aircraft carriers, and other things, my question for you would be, would you have seen that as a positive result 6 months ago? To me, I think it's beyond what I would have seen as a positive result. And that I'm not saying there aren't risks. I'm just saying you're telling us there are risks, but are we in a favorable position today?
That's a really difficult question, Paul. The risk that I see here is state failure and collapse. In Syria, where it's basically already happened, in Lebanon, where it seems to be on the horizon, and those sorts of outcomes lead to completely unpredictable power vacuums where terrorist groups can take control. Look at the Taliban that's had this resurgence in Afghanistan. They lead to massively negative outcomes for neighboring countries, whether it's terrorist groups committing attacks where there's refugee flows into Turkey or Europe or North Africa. So yes, I mean, to some extent, a lot of the developments taken in and of themselves may seem positive, but the broader regional strategic situation is completely in flux, and it's impossible to say whether it's moving in a positive or a negative direction because there are simply too many actors with too many conflicting interests and fluctuating capacities to pursue those interests that I'd say it's impossible to really say whether the situation is good, bad, or otherwise over there at the moment.
All right. So, Bob, I'm going to give you the last chance to defend your column. But before we do, I want to say a couple of things. I see it as being positive, but I see it as being positive because my narrow view of the world is that we have three major adversaries who are looking for regional governments: Russia, China, and Iran. And in two of those cases, they've both been set back. I see that as being an advantage. Number two, I want Donald Trump to be an incredible success, whether he's doing it through bluster or serious threats or whatever he's doing. I want him to be an incredible success. I'm worried about the conflict on his own side between the America First group. I can buy into the idea that we don't want to buy into endless wars. That makes sense to me. But the idea that we don't preserve the American world order, which takes allies, deeply worries me. And I see there as being a conflict. I look at Joe Biden, and my view of it is that while he isn't going to get the chance to be able to talk about the advantage that he brought in, I think that we're in a fairly good position in the United States today. And in fact, I think you're right. Trump made those comments more to take credit for something that might happen as opposed to being instead of trying to actually move some type of foreign policy. I don't think he thought he was going to move foreign policy. I thought he was going to be able to take credit for if the hostages were released, he'd be able to say that he got credit. Well, that's not anything new for a politician for me, so it doesn't much matter to me. I just want to see success there. You've written a lot about the Middle East over time. You've written a lot about Ukraine. Give me your overall theory about where we are.
Well, let the columns stand for itself. It was mostly about the breach of protocol that was occurring less about the specifics of developments in the Middle East. But I will say this. I believe that Israel succeeded significantly by ignoring the advice and pressure that it was receiving from the Biden administration. But on the other hand, Biden could have done a lot more to undermine and constrain Israel and either prevent it from doing what it did or incur significant greater international pressure as a result. So I would give a mixed reading on it, as I would with Ukraine. I think it is true that his willingness to supply Ukraine with weaponry and his attempt at this point to push as much aid as possible before Trump enters office and threatens that continuation of aid, had a role in making Syria vulnerable. So I have sort of a mixed view of all that. While I fully acknowledge Henry's concerns, I think it's fair to describe Syria under Assad as a failed state. I think Lebanon could properly be described as a failed state for many years now. I think that our attempts to try to micromanage developments in the Middle East have proved futile. One of the things that I've objected to both parties is an attempt to tell Israel how to protect itself and defend itself, substituting our view for theirs. I think that's a mistake. I am fearful of developments, but where we have intervened with the development of Islamist governance in Egypt and in Palestine has turned out to be a mistake. The act of governing can be a moderating experience. And I think we need to have a light hand in what occurs here with full recognition of the dangers that Henry, I think, very eloquently and well articulated.
I also, I'm going to give Biden credit for something else. And maybe it's just, I can't help myself. I'm going to give the underdog credit. There are a lot of things I haven't
You're already
liked about Joe Biden.
nostalgic for the Biden era. You're already nostalgic for the Biden era.
I wouldn't say I'm nostalgic for the Biden era, but that's good. That's funny. I can tell you there are a number of things that I have been disturbed about with Biden, and probably the biggest one has been the constant. H.R. McMaster said it the other day. I thought he did a great job, Henry, when he was on with you and I. He said, look, quit telling people what your limits are. By telling people your limits, you're projecting to them what you won't do. And by projecting to them what you won't do, they know how to react to you. I think that was a very, very valid criticism. One of the benefits I think that's happening with Biden right now, or maybe an area that he needs credit, a lot of people are pointing out that he's arming up Ukraine, and the argument is he's doing that before Trump gets in, so that they have a better fighting chance. Well, maybe that's what he's doing. Maybe what he's also doing is setting up Trump so that he has a better chance of negotiating a peace. If you really want to negotiate a peace with Russia, you're probably not going to negotiate one when Ukraine looks weak and it looks like they're not going to gain the support that they need. And the idea that they have arms and weapons and that they can still move forward, so long as Trump doesn't rip the rug out from underneath that by saying that he wouldn't continue that, it gives him the leverage that he's going to need to be able to move Putin. And I think Putin is at a stage where he needs to move. One of the big changes that happened, I think, in the last 2 months, it's been rather obvious, is that the Russian economy is now being affected by this. For a long time, the war economy was able to increase the amount of economic output in their country. They were able to expand their economy. There was lots of money going into the production of goods inside their community by inflating their own monetary supply, and they weren't seeing the effects of it. Now what's taking place is as their currency is dropping based upon the yuan and the dollar and others, they're seeing a position where they're having to increase interest rates up to a 21 percentile rate. I think that's problematic for Russia long term. Now, I'm way out of my league on talking about that. Eliott, any thoughts that you might have on what you think Russia's positions might be here as over the last couple of months? I'd love to hear it.
Russia economically and demographically is on borrowed time. And all he's doing is hastening their demise, and where he won't be able to deal with things. Even China is now having to deal with things basically that they did in the past few years that made them look much stronger than they actually were in terms of economically. If Trump is going to get Biden to do anything, their economy has to be lousy. They have to be running out of people to send in as fodder, and Ukraine has to be well armed. And the threats that Putin seemed to be making now strike me as the threats of a desperate man.
Yeah, and by the way, I think Trump has an opportunity here too that maybe Biden didn't have, and the opportunity is the idea that that maybe Putin might be more willing to settle with him than Biden. I think is an opportunity. I just think that he's got to do that through strength, not weakness, and I'm hoping that's what he does.
I think Biden had an opportunity that Donald Trump doesn't have, which was to prevent Putin from invading Ukraine in the first place.
Through deterrence?
Absolutely. Various other means.
Well, through not de facto saying, if you go in, we're not going to do anything.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a mess.
All right. So I'm going to create just a short change here, and this is just a small commentary, but I'd love to have your all thoughts on what's going on. We had this, I'm going to call him a young guy, but this CEO of UnitedHealthCare who ended up being assassinated. The guy who assassinated him seems to be a very smart guy who is mentally deranged, but in many cases, he's becoming a hero of people who are talking about the healthcare problem. I can tell you that is definitely happening on the left. I don't know if it's happening across the board, but I've just seen a number of left blogs that have been kind of lionizing him, talking about why it is that these healthcare companies ought to know how much damage they're creating. And then you had a guy like Chris Rock the other day who made the comment that while he hated to see him shot, that drug dealers get shot also. I guess that ignores the fact that comedians get slapped in the face and complain about it, much less being assassinated. But the point I guess I would make is I'm worried a little bit about how we can move to being that insensitive in our community when someone ends up being killed the way that this CEO of UnitedHealthCare was murdered. I don't know, maybe it's just a small portion of society, but from at least my standpoint, you don't create a justification for someone being killed, even by creating some type of level playing field between the idea of someone being murdered and what's happening on premium costs. Any thoughts on that whole subject?
I'm just going to say the whole thing's very sick. The person who did this was a sick person. And Elizabeth Warren and her comments and AOC and her comments, I just thought they were sick people. They were essentially egging on people saying, yeah, it was okay. I understand it. How do you understand the absolute murder of somebody who's just running a business and having to deal with market forces and government regulation every day? I'm not saying this guy was perfect, but to shoot somebody because you don't like his policies as a businessman, that's just crazy. And it should have been condemned by everyone. And even and like I said, the political left is not condemning it, which shows you where they're at. I just think they are horrendous people.
Yeah, and again, they're making it a moral equivalent. And to me, once you make it a moral equivalent, you are justifying it.
Yeah, I saw a newsletter piece that came out from interview with Bernie Sanders and Jacobin magazine straight after this, and without even a word of condolences to the family, he went straight over to talking about politics. I thought that was pretty tone deaf and heartless. I read some of the Reddit forums because I saw in some of the reporting that he'd been active on the social media site Reddit. So I went on there to see some of the commentary on it, and it was again just quite chilling, the support that he was getting for killing this CEO based on sort of a political agenda. And I just I don't think there's any justification for an individual act of violence based on structural problems, right? You can believe that there's a problem with inequality or access to healthcare in this country, but you also have to recognize that the avenue for changing that is through the democratic political system, not through some sort of active vigilante violence. There are many people with many grievances against other people in every society in the world, and if they all started killing each other, then it would be a very, very dark world indeed. And so I've been really troubled actually by the responses to this.
I would echo those sentiments, but would observe that trying to take political advantage of acts of political violence isn't new in our country, nor is it limited to one faction or the other. I do think that it's becoming more common and is part of the coarsening of our civil and civic life, and is I don't know what you do about it other than condemn it. And I think that the people on the left who have done that are getting a bit of a backlash. And you do have some people like John Fetterman, the senator from Pennsylvania, Democratic senator, who's flat called out his colleagues on the left for doing exactly that. That you don't have a but after you say it's wrong to murder somebody. You don't have a but. You stop there. I think his point was very eloquently made.
Sometimes commentary is all we have. I think that part of what happened, we've spoken a lot about what's happened with the woke left. I think the woke left's been beat back. You could argue, well, it's because Donald Trump won. We've been talking about this for a while. I think they've been beat back because there's a lot of commentary coming from a lot of people on both the right and the left who say, look, this is just outrageous, the position that they've taken. It's important when you see people creating these types of moral equivalences where there seems to be some justification to murder, that people speak up and they talk about why that's wrong. And hopefully we learn from that. We learn from the whole concept of the free marketplace of ideas, as we've spoken about, that when people hear it, they say, yeah, I don't think I actually buy into that either. All right, so one last subject, and I'm really excited about this. So one of my criticisms of the Biden administration, and we've done this on this podcast, is I really did not like his committee to begin, or his efforts to begin to try to regulate AI technology. My own personal opinion is, if we lose the AI war, we are in big trouble. But obviously, there are a lot of people who are afraid of what AI may mean to the world and to the United States. In fact, Elon Musk has been one of the guys who've been promoting it. But this week, there were a series of announcements that make me think that it almost is going to be unregulatable. The changes are going to happen regardless. First, Elon Musk had some big announcements, what he was able to do with going from somewhere near 20 to 30,000 GPUs that could interact and talk to one another in AI technology, to being able to jump to almost 100,000, and what he's now arguing will be 1 million, is a game changer, even listening to the people who are inside the AI technology side. But then what Google was able to announce this week with what they've been able to accomplish with quantum computing, that is incredibly significant with the Willow chip. The Willow chip, what we know about quantum computing is that it is a monumental leap from where we are with digital computing. If you look at the amount of time that they said that I thought it was fascinating. They said the amount of time that it took them to process a question that that their system could answer with quantum computing in 5 minutes would take the most high-powered supercomputer literally that we have on the planet. It would take it as long to solve that problem as the time frame that the entire universe was formed. So to me, it's just fascinating to see how quickly these changes are happening. Now, Google's had kind of a good month between what's been happening with their driverless vehicle, what's taken place with this chip, and then they also did the Gemini 2 that was announced this week. We're seeing major advancements that are happening on this. And while I may every now and then get irritated with Elon by some of the comments that he made, like I mentioned last week with Colonel Vindman, I really do think he is an incredible force in the United States and a force for good in that he's helping move this change forward. I'd love to have your all thoughts on that, especially as it relates to the governmental side and whether or not we should or should not be regulating it.
I think I agree with you, Paul. It's very difficult to regulate an industry that's moving so fast and at a level of technological sophistication that any legislation or rule development is going to be months or years behind what the companies are doing. And so I think it's going to be difficult to regulate the industry. I'm not an expert on AI. I know that there are people that have concerns about ethical implications of this, about broader implications for the future of humanity of the AI proceeding at such a rapid pace and taking on such high levels of computational ability. I think it's going to be one of the interesting developments of the 21st century, and it's going to affect a lot of people's livelihoods. Is I think something that's going to happen is a lot of people, the way they work is going to change really fast, and people are going to have to be able to be prepared for that change. So it's going to present new challenges to a lot of people, and some people are going to be better equipped to deal with them than others. That's probably my main concern about the development of this economy, is that people receive the education and the training that they need to be able to adapt and to be able to use these tools going forward, and that we don't see some sort of new exponential returns to education that would increase inequality and make it difficult for people to get ahead in the future.
You know, the changes that it's going to make are they're certainly monumental, and they'll have some negative and positive effects. As an example, I think half of all marketing today is done by Meta and Google. There's already been a movement away from the large marketing firms and houses that used to control that industry to the computer industry now owning it. And that's going to change again as we start to see AI technology and quantum computing taking over, the ability to create ads faster and quicker. Of course, as a business person, especially a young startup business, being able to sit down at a computer and being able to tie into AI technology and to create a marketing ad that could help them move their product means that more people are going to have access to better product. So those most of the big marketing used to be not only controlled by 4 or 5 of the major firms, it was only really given to the major companies. Now lots of small companies can benefit from it as well. At the same time, you look at things like immunotherapy. Immunotherapy is so complex. I remember Patrick Sin-Soon, who came in and spoke to us about the war on cancer, talked about how complex it was to be able to map the genome and to be able to figure out how to attack different cancers by changing the immunotherapy of I think it was called the T cell. The point that he made was that there's not just one type of cancer, not even one type of liver cancer. There are thousands of types of liver cancer that the immune system is not used to being able to deal with. The idea that you can begin to map that through quantum computing says that we may be able to get answers to people on cancer literally in minutes that are unsolvable today. The potential for this to change human life, there will be some negative, but overwhelmingly, in my opinion, I see it being for the public's good, which is always the issue with regulation, right? If you believe that on net balance, mankind is bad, as opposed to on net balance, mankind is good, well, then you want more regulations. If you believe that in general, if we allowed everybody to invent things, we'd move more towards the negative, then you would say we need more regulations to fix this. On the other hand, if you believe that at the end of the day, with innovations, having to serve people in the public who want to buy it or not want to buy it ends up being a force for good, then you would not want to regulate it or to have the least amount of regulations possible. My belief is we really need to get out of the way on this one. The good news is, I don't know if it's going to matter if we try to get in the way because the changes are happening so fast. I don't know that we can interfere with it.
I've not seen a convincing case in favor of regulating AI. I'm not worried about the disruptive effects of AI economically. We've always adjusted and benefited from technological advancements. Where I am worried is AI's use in war, removing human judgment regarding the use of lethal force. I can see being a cascading and worrisome scenario. So, except for that, and I don't know, I mean, that's going to be impossible to regulate if countries perceive competitive advantage to increased use of AI in lieu of human judgment and the exercise and use of lethal force. I don't know how you constrain that, but in terms of this new technology, that's the only worry I have. And other than that, I think hands off is the best approach.
Yeah, and it's interesting from a military standpoint. The reason the military is deeply involved in the quantum computing is it breaks all encryption codes. So they're having to create post-quantum types of codes that will keep people from being able to break into them. As an example, Bitcoin. Bitcoin today, you almost can't break into somebody's code to be able to get their Bitcoin. That's not true with quantum computing. You can break into their system within minutes. So everything's going to have to change, and it's going to have to change quickly. And the military is concerned about that one aspect. I think what you're also right about is that as you begin to change the devices, what's being deployed in the military, what's utilizing AI technology, we end up getting into a race on that side. And I don't know if that advances war or if it deters war. What's fascinating about it to me is while I may worry about it, I'm probably more worried about losing that race, because losing that race would be detrimental to us. Thoughts?
I'm not sure whether it's a race, given our values, that we will engage in fully. I don't think the United States is going to move down the continuum of removing human judgment about the use of lethal force. I don't have the same confidence in some of our adversaries. So I worry about it in terms of its potential consequence, and I worry about it in terms of if we are going to reach agreement that there should be human judgment involved in that, how we make sure that that's universal and that we are not unilaterally disarming ourselves and putting ourselves in the position of losing that race. I think our values make us more hesitant to go down that road than some of our adversaries are likely to be.
Yep. Well, Bob, thank you so much. I also want to point out that you've been writing some great articles. If you want to read Bob's articles, go to Substack. You can find him there. Those articles are, in my opinion, they're some of the best written in the country. So thanks so much for being on the show again today.
Thank you.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.